Good afternoon. I'm Dee Dee Petri, President and CEO of the National Association for Olmstead Parks, the managing partner of Olmstead 200. I'm delighted to welcome you to Conversations with Olmstead, the second in an ongoing series exploring facets of Olmsted's far-reaching influence on America's physical landscape and social fabric. We have a great turnout today with people watching from across the country and as far away as Japan and Europe. Thanks so much for joining us. We're looking ahead to 2022 when we celebrate the 200th birthday of Frederick Law Olmsted. Olmstead 200 is the nationwide celebration and exploration of his life and legacy. Literally hundreds of events are being planned to engage communities with Olmsted's values and vision and his belief that parks belong to all people. You can find a wealth of information about upcoming events, toolkits, and Olmsted resources at our website, olmsted200.org. Please visit us often. Olmsted began his career at an exciting time in our nation's history. America was transitioning from a rural to a more urban society. And while many of his countrymen decried cities, Olmsted saw them as centers of opportunity. By his own estimation, he was 100 years ahead of his time, anticipating massive population growth and creating urban parks and landscapes that over time would be surrounded by urban development. 150 years later, his vision has surely been realized. Hundreds of landscapes by Olmsted and the Olmsted firm can still be enjoyed today from coast to coast. That's why today's program is called Creating Parks for the Ages. As we explored last time, Olmsted understood that thoughtful design offers social, civic, and ecological benefits for the long term. And as we will hear today, Olmsted's parks have shown amazing adaptability over nearly 2 centuries, operating center stage during COVID-19, offering a platform for our ongoing national discussion about equity and social justice, and serving on the front lines in the campaign to combat climate change. That's why I'm so excited about today's conversation with 3 amazing and innovative park leaders from Louisville, New York City, and Seattle, and 1 extraordinary moderator as we undertake a deeper discussion about the critical role public parks play and how they can best address today's ecological, social, and cultural challenges. We hope to gain insights into how best to ensure equitable access to public parks and to sustain them for future generations. I know we look forward to hearing about our panelists' personal and professional experiences and their advice for future park stewards on ways to meet the needs of our communities. Please use the chat box to tell us where you come from and any commentary or reactions, and rely on the Q&A box to ask any questions of our panelists. We will do our best to keep our conversation to 1 hour, and we will have a Q&A session towards the end. We will try to answer as many questions as possible and balance our time together. With that, it's now my honor to introduce today's speakers. Our moderator is Karen Phillips, Fellow American Society of Landscape Architects and recipient of the 2021 Landscape Architecture Foundation Medal. She is known to her friends and colleagues for her steadfast commitment to equitable and sustainable urban development and is recognized as a leading figure of the second Harlem Renaissance. Karen's career spans real estate, urban planning and revitalization, environmental design, community development, and public service. Susan Donahue is the president of Prospect Park Alliance and park administrator at Prospect Park. I know that many argue that Prospect Park is Olmsted and Vaux's greatest park. Perhaps we can have a debate about that today. Sue is responsible for setting the vision and overall strategy for Prospect Park. And before her appointment, she served as a senior advisor and assistant commissioner at New York City Parks. From Louisville, let us welcome Layla George, who's the president CEO of Olmsted Parks Conservancy. A Louisville native, she came to the Conservancy with a broad background in nonprofit leadership, fundraising, and land conservation. Before joining the Conservancy, she served as the Director of Development for Louisville Public Media. And here from the West Coast, Jennifer Ott, Assistant Director of History Link and Steering Committee Vice Chair of the Volunteer Park Trust in Seattle, Washington, a park designed by John Charles Olmsted. Jennifer is an environmental historian and an acclaimed author of works including Olmstead in Seattle, Creating a Park System for a Modern City. You can see it behind me. Thank you so much to all of you for being here this afternoon and participating in our discussion. Karen, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Dee Dee. I am just overjoyed to be a part of this discussion, as Olmsted has his life and his work helped me find my passion in the profession of landscape architecture. But now that we have three wonderful cities represented with Olmsted Parks, I thought it might be great to say which one is the greatest parks. So ladies, anybody want to start with that? Layla?
Sure, I'll start. This is hard because I do love Prospect Park, and I think Seattle's my favorite city, probably in large part to the parks, but I think Louisville can make a strong case for having the best parks. We have 17 Olmsted parks here in Louisville, connected by 6 parkways. So we have an Olmsted park system, which is pretty unique. There's only 4 of those in the country. This was one of the last projects that Frederick Law Olmsted worked on himself. And so we like to say that by the time he got to Louisville, he'd really figured it out. And this is kind of the best interpretation of his vision here.
Hey, Sue, what do you think?
Well, it would be so hard to choose, but I am, of course, biased.
Okay.
You know, we call Prospect Park Brooklyn's backyard, and it certainly is that, with 585 beautiful acres in the middle of what is a very busy, bustling city in and of itself. It is such an oasis for all of Brooklyn. And I, you know, again, I know I am biased, but I think it does provide such an incredible outlet for so many. And as was mentioned at the beginning, we do often also say that whereas Central Park is obviously so well known and is such an incredible asset for New York, we like to say that he got, you know, Olmsted got a start in Central Park, but 10 years later, he really got it right in Prospect Park.
Great. Okay. Jennifer, the last word now.
Well, I get to be last. So way out here on the left coast, I have to say we have the benefit of being the second generation. The Olmsted brothers are Olmsteds, and Volunteer Park is one of about 82 Olmsted parks, Olmsted associated parks and parkways in Seattle. We have a park system also that we are just incredibly lucky that our early Board of Park Commissioners acquired that land when they did. And but I will say of the park itself, the things that really put it head and shoulders above the rest, I think, is that we have borrowed landscape. One of the things in Seattle you see is that John Olmsted really looked outside of the parks because of our incredible natural scenery. So one of the primary axes of design in Volunteer Park is a view out over a reservoir and over Puget Sound to the Olympic Mountains. And it's spectacular. Our water tower for the municipal water system is in the park, and Olmsted helped locate that so that it would flow seamlessly between the residential area and the park. And then when you climb to the top of it, he had them make it into an observatory tower also, and you get 360-degree views of the region. And so, and then as an added bonus, just as a coincidence of time, is that when you're in our park, you get a real sense of the cultural geography of Seattle. The context of the park, the elements of the park really tell you about the social and economic history of Seattle. And it's a really interesting layer to experience Volunteer Park in that way.
Thank you. Well, we're brought together today because in 2022, we are celebrating the 200th anniversary of Olmsted's birth and 150 years of public parks and environments that he created and influenced. Most of us will agree that Olmsted parks are long-lived and vibrant, and yet social, cultural, environmental demands are different today than they were when Olmsted created these designs. How can Olmsted parks adapt and embrace the changing realities while retaining some of the essential qualities of an Olmstead park?
I'll jump in here that for us, the changing world has presented both opportunities and cautions. We look at the opportunities are that as long as we stay within the intended function, either a program space or a passive recreation space, that we actually have some flexibility to maintain that Olmstedian feel and keep those Olmstedian principles intact, the design elements. But, you can do quite a bit with how people want to use parks within that parameter. But we also have with increasing population pressure and all of the things that have to happen in cities, we really spend a lot of time cautioning people that open space is not empty space. That just because there's a spot for that does not mean we should fill it with something new. And we've had some happy success stories where the city solved a combined sewer overflow project problem that might have led to a real conflicting use in the park, but through careful design and thinking, we got improvements to the park and a remarkable environmental improvement to the sewer system here. And so, but when the idea first came, it was going to be a big old facility right in an open space in the park. And so I really want a bumper sticker that says open space is not empty space. Or sorry, yeah, empty, yeah, that's right.
Sue or Layla, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, Karen, I'd be happy to jump in. I mean, it's something that we think about all the time here in Prospect Park because we see over 10 million visitors a year today in Prospect Park. And so we have had to adapt and evolve, but very much with the idea of the respect for the landscape and the original design. And I think one great example of that, the biggest kind of restoration project that we ever took on here in the park was our Lakeside Center, which is a beautiful new year-round, it's ice skating facility in the winter and roller skating in the summer. And when Olmstead designed this park, the lake was used for ice skating. It is a long, wonderful history, but we needed to re-envision and reimagine this space for ice skating and really make it so it's a year-round destination. So it's about being really thoughtful about the design, really incorporating it and embedding it into the landscape. And in the process, we were really able to recapture and rethink how the space was utilized. So not only creating a very green building with a green roof and really adding so much in terms of landscape and planting and ecological benefits, but we got rid of a very large 250-car parking lot that sat in the middle of our park. And in so doing, we were able to actually gain 3 acres of green space by getting rid of that parking lot and siting the ice skating rink as we did. And so, and that's a very hard thing to do in a big city like Brooklyn, to actually gain green space in a restoration. And so I think it's a really good example of how you can retain the beauty and the aesthetic and the design, but actually update it so that now it's, it's a year-round facility, as I said, for ice skating and roller skating, and it can accommodate, we see about 250,000 people a year. It's extraordinary, the use and the love for the space, but very much in keeping with the original Olmstead design.
Great. Layla, you have an example for us?
Sure. I mean, I think that while some of the causes of some of these challenges are very different than they were 130 years ago, the personal impact is the same. Olmstead designed these parks to be a mental and physical escape from city life. And he wanted places where people could go and experience clean air, maybe because of pollution from coal or the threat of tuberculosis. Well, we saw in this past year that people went to parks because of, again, the fear of this pandemic and sickness, and fresh air and sunshine as a disinfectant still offers the same benefits that they offered 130 years ago. And I think from the mental standpoint, that's as evident today as it was back then, maybe more so. People really flocking to our parks as a place to escape and you look at his design of entering probably any number of our parks where you immediately feel transported. You feel like you're in a different environment. The city sort of melts away. You can't hear it or see it. And all the value of that is still just critical to individual personal health today as it was then.
We gathered today to explore Olmsted's legacy and, of course, the commitment of all the people, and in particular our partners in this effort, to preserve the parks for the future. But as leaders, what are some of the priorities, if you could just list a couple, in terms of tackling preservation, conservation, but also kind of environmental sustainability, which is something that I've been more keenly focused on more of late? Anybody got examples?
I can jump in, Karen. Yeah, so there's so many different areas that we think about. One is, we are fortunate here in Prospect Park that we have 250 acres of core woodlands in the middle of our park, and that's something that it's been in the Alliance's DNA for over 30 years, is really the care and maintenance of those woodlands and the restoration and the removal of invasive species. It's a big part of our it's the biggest part of our budget is landscape management, and it is a core part of our mission is the care of those woodlands. When we came into existence, the woodlands were considered a place that were almost scary and dangerous. People wouldn't want to walk into the interior of the park and walk into those paths. And that was a big part of the reason why we focused. One, it was desperately needed, but two, we wanted people to explore the park. And now fast forward these 32, 33 years, and you see, as Leila said, definitely, especially during the pandemic, people just needing that walk in the woods and that escape has been so important. The other area that we're really focused on is water quality. We have a big lake in the park and have really suffered from issues of blue-green algae. And so we've worked with Brooklyn College, a local college, on a pilot, an eco-ware to use plants actually to help us to clean the water, remove the phosphates that are causing this blue-green algae. So in all of our projects, we are looking to enhance and fortify the landscape and really with an eye towards enhancing its sustainability. Because as we all know, with climate change, the intensity of storms are increasing. So it's a constant battle and frankly, constant concern, and something we have to be really, really focused on in our work.
Water issue is going to be a big one, and it sounds funny coming from Seattle, but we've always had summer droughts, but they are getting much longer, much drier. It's been 50 some days since we had rain here, and I feel parched, but it's also a change in precipitation patterns that's worrisome. And Volunteer Park is a park of trees. There's groves of trees, there's specimen trees, there's trees that frame views. And it's so concerning of how do you replace those with hardier versions? If you have to look at completely different species, or you have to look at different varieties of native trees, and because it's a mix of native and ornamental trees. But then also looking at across the park system and where the investments go. Volunteer Park is in a wealthier and wider neighborhood. And so the whole park system is going to suffer with these issues, and maintaining the tree canopy. And so looking at how different communities will feel the impact of those changes, because there will be the replacement period. That period as the trees grow up, that will really have an impact on people's experiences in our parks. And so we're wrestling with that. And also, people love their trees. And so it's going to be, I feel like it's going to be a bit of a social experience as we go through this change, that I can't imagine not having Douglas fir and cedar, and there's a massive sequoia that is just spectacular. And I can't imagine the park without those. So it'll be interesting how we deal with that as a community.
I want to jump on an issue with you about the priorities and funding. And I just share, a lot of your background in terms of nonprofit management and your MBA, but to be a park leader with that background and knowing that we now, because of the last 18 months, there are greater demands on parks. And you mentioned, and we'll talk more about the mental issues, but people are now with the priorities of funding in cities that are really hurting, that funding will be an issue. And what can we do to make public officials view these spaces as critical and give park budgets and more resources so that they can flourish?
Sure. Well, I think it was a conversation with Charles Birnbaum where he said parks die of 1,000 cuts. They die a slow death. And so it's not immediately transparent, the effects of those budget cuts until it's many years down the road. So what we do a lot with our park neighbors is really work on advocacy. We have friends groups around a lot of our different parks to really figure out what they want and need to see in their parks, but encouraging them to contact their legislators, their Metro Council representatives, the mayor's office, join a neighborhood association. All those types of civic engagement really can help drive the public conversation, because we see time and time again, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And so the neighbors who are really complaining about the water fountain not working, they're the ones who are going to get it fixed. So that works. And so that's what we are really encouraging people to do, is take an active role in this budget process, especially with some of the stimulus money that's coming through, hoping that we can direct some of those towards public sector jobs and really beef up the public forestry department and the public parks, and get some of this deferred maintenance taken care of.
Jennifer, do you have any examples or something else that's happening on the West Coast in terms of funding?
So it's interesting. Seattleites love our parks. Just every levy that comes before them gets voted, easily approved. But the challenge is that in order to put together a package that is appealing to voters, you often have to go for the new and the acquisition and the fancy sort of eye candy parts of parks, which are lovely and amazing. But as a result, it's much harder to get the funding for, just vegetation management and invasive removal and the nitty gritty that really, I don't think happily many people realize, because they do such a good job with what they can, how much important that is to the experience in parks. And so a few years back, Seattle formed a Metropolitan Park District as a way to introduce a steadier revenue stream that doesn't require that kind of salesmanship, that it can rely more on the long-term decision-making of the Parks Department, whose expertise it is to balance that maintenance, capital projects, and then recreational opportunities and the fun stuff that's very pretty. And so, we're just getting our feet under us with that. And it seems like the world has not been normal a single year that it's been in existence. So it's still hard to tell what will happen, but I'm hopeful that it will help.
This is a great title, but the heat is on. This is a special report from the Trust for Public Land, and it's a group that I know that walks the talk in terms of some of the projects that they've done. But they did a study and found that parks in areas, communities that have more Black, Indigenous people, people of color, are 5 times more crowded and half the size of parks in other communities, and with, of course, other inequalities. How do we begin to address these challenges when it comes to equitable access to parks? How do we promote activities, resources, and services to BIPOC communities to strengthen their relationship with their local parks? And how can Olmsted's values and work inform these efforts? Sue, I know that your Commissioner Silver has been working a lot on that. So when you work for parks, but maybe you have some examples in Prospect Park.
Absolutely. Yes, Karen. It's something that we think a lot about and have worked really hard on. Prospect Park is bounded by a hugely diverse series of neighborhoods, and we are very, very anxious to be as welcoming and as accessible to all sides of the park as possible. So one of the ways that we have done that is to partner with specific organizations, whether it be Caribbean, which is an organization that celebrates Caribbean heritage. And so we have a month-long partnership in June with Caribbean, where we celebrate different aspects of Caribbean heritage, or working with the Brooklyn Arts Council that has a hugely diverse set of different musicians and artists that they partner with. So we have different cultural offerings in the park. What we've looked to do is, through our partnerships and our public programming, really partner with those communities that are very grassroots, that are very connected to different local communities on the ground, so that people will, and communities that will resonate with, and activities that will resonate with our local communities of color, so that we are offering very diverse programs with a very wide range of interests. The other thing that we have done, and that we've spent a lot of time thinking about, is the role of Prospect Park as convener, and ways that we can help support people. So many people are using the park, as I said, literally billions come every year. But how can we help facilitate knowledge sharing or information sharing? We've got a big, huge platform and canvas here. So we've done things like with the census, and with our desire to help with people filling out the census. We use Prospect Park spaces in Prospect Park for tabling, we held a workshop of job fair, so that people who wanted to participate and have a job working for the Census Bureau, again, partnering with local nonprofit organizations, so that we could both, while people were in the park and using the park, also help to provide information that was important, that we wanted to have be as widespread and available to all the diverse communities around the park. So the way that we've really, focused on equity and access is both through our partnerships and public programs, and then also through our using, these acres to provide information that's really needed for a variety of people. And then just the last thing I'll say quickly, you're right, Commissioner Silver, our Parks Commissioner, our now outgoing Parks Commissioner, has done an amazing job and had a wonderful initiative that's called Parks Without Borders. It was really about how do we open up parks as much as possible to the public, make them feel as accessible and welcoming as possible. So we had one long stretch of the park on the east side that did not have an entrance. And so through funding through this Parks Without Borders initiative, we were able to open that side up to the community. And it happens to be a community or a series of communities on the east side of the park that are more resource constrained and are definitely more diverse, and that we wanted to make sure people felt welcomed. And so that is a project that we completed and opened up the Flatbush side of the park through this Parks Without Borders initiative, and it's really been fantastic.
I just wanted to cover another study, because a lot of these issues are connected, but another study was by the Urban Institute, who I think Dee Dee is one of the partners in this celebration of Olmstead. But they were examining ways of this equitable park spending. And this particular report identified critical factors, including understanding priorities, and then also recognizing the kind of legacy of segregation, and something that I am very aware of in a lot of the work that I've done. But given the focus now on our nation's attention to racial and social inequities, do you think cities will reprioritize and support physical and social and ecological needs in communities? And how does that relate to the work that you're doing in parks? And I don't know, Layla or Jennifer, you guess? Okay.
I'll jump in.
All right, okay.
So, Louisville certainly has a history of redlining. It's evident. You can see the neighborhoods that were redlined have far lower tree canopies, they're hotter, the life expectancy is 12 years younger than places just a mile away. So it's very apparent here. We have more parks in that part of town than any other part of our city. Just the nature of being kind of urban, an urban park system. So what we have found is that there's increased pressure on the parks. So you talked about, parks and communities of color having, far more people use them. I think part of the reason is there's not many other places to go for birthday parties, for cookouts, for any sort of, physical recreation. I don't see that as a bad thing. I think it's wonderful. They're so vibrant, they're so active, and the people in those communities have a stronger personal connection to their park than in any other part of our town. They have family reunions in these parks where everybody who ever lived there or grandmother lived there comes back for this celebration day. So what we try to do is work with those neighbors to figure out what they want and need, and then really, again, encouraging them to take action. I think community engagement can be a talking point, but to us, it's really been meaningful to have really deep social, connection with the people that use those parks. And in turn, they really want to take care of it, and they'll come help clean up, and they'll come help plant, and they'll water what we've planted. So it's been really a wonderful relationship. And again, those are voters. So what we do is when we go to the mayor every year and request funding for specific projects, we can say that we have the support of the neighborhood association, the Friends group, the Metro Council representative, because they all know their constituents are behind it. So that has proven successful for us.
Sounds great. Jennifer, you have examples?
We've been working with the Seattle Parks Foundation because one of the issues that we're finding in Seattle is, and I'm not sure if this is as true in other cities, is that even though parks are an absolutely essential part of the infrastructure, a lot of the funding and special projects is raised by neighborhoods and the areas directly surrounding the parks. And so I often say that's absolutely ridiculous, because we would never ask people to raise money for the street in front of their house. I don't know why we're asking them to raise money for the park in front of their house. But it's just a mindset that I think it will take a while to turn around. But in the meantime, we're realizing that disparities of fundraising ability, just the capacity of who can you tap into for donations, but then also the grant writing experience, the grant reporting experience, the communications networks, all of those things that when you want to do a project in a park like Volunteer Park that has a network of people that are more affluent, it is easier. And there's that results in disparities in development. We're very lucky that our park system, our Olmstead park system, is really well developed throughout the city as far as locations and acquisitions. It's not as well developed with the amenities throughout the city. And so we're making an effort to partner with the organizations around the other neighborhood parks to help them sort of use their Olmstead connection as a selling point, because that speaks to people who make donations that this is an Olmstead park, and we can help them identify those elements that they can sort of use to tell the story of the park, but then also sharing our expertise in those different sort of nuts and bolts parts of fundraising and project completion, so that there's less disparity in sort of resources that people have to draw upon. So, and then I'll throw out too that another thing we're kind of working on in Seattle is that the invisible barrier issue. We have less of the rigid segregation that you see in some other parts of the country, but we certainly have segregated housing and communities. And so we're looking at those things that make people from BIPOC communities feel less welcome in parks. And for example, there's a plaque in Volunteer Park that memorializes the volunteers in the wars of 1898 that were volunteers from Seattle, volunteer soldiers. And the problem with it is that the text of the memorial is inaccurate and offensive. And so when somebody who is Cuban American or Puerto Rican or Filipino American goes to the park, it's very unwelcome. You know, it's a passive unwelcome, but it is a very unwelcoming piece of a very unwelcoming experience. And so we're looking at how do we replace that monument or simply remove it, and with still being sensitive to the veterans that it recognizes, but to that the plaque is just simply wrong and it's offensive. And so what do we do so that when somebody from a community of color comes into the neighborhood, into the park, it's a city park, it needs to be welcoming to everyone. So we're working on that.
It's a great point. I wanted to just, when we talk about welcoming, we know that a lot of the activities in the last year, for sure, and particularly, well, Louisville, a lot of the activities around commemorating some of the racial incidents, particularly Breonna Taylor's death, happened in the streets and parks. So we know that Frederick Law Olmsted was felt that the parks, and I think you mentioned it earlier, were a place to heal people. How do we, and you talked a lot about, Layla, about the community engagement, but how do we try to embody that democratic ideal in our parks? What other examples do you have to share with other Olmsted parks, or just other urban areas, or even rural areas, in terms of being able to have a place to do that? The Olmsted's kind of places for people to recreate themselves and breathe and heal.
Sure. So it was a lot going on here in the past, year and a half. There were protests in the streets every single day. And a lot of it did happen in our Olmsted parks. There were a lot of protests there. There were also prayer circles that were happening in our Olmsted parks. And then we saw COVID testing in one of our parks, and now COVID vaccination happening in our parks. So kind of all these things coming together in that space. And for us as a staff, we were very introspective. We had a lot of conversations to sort of figure out what was our role in all of this. It was pretty apparent what role parks played. They were safe spaces, at least that's the goal. And so for us, what we tried to do was make sure they felt as safe and welcoming to everyone, regardless. So, sort of what Jennifer was saying as well, what is people's experience coming into the park, and how can we make that better so that they do feel safe to cry and mourn and shout and protest, all of those things that come with democracy. And it's, having shade and having a place to sit down and having water and bathrooms and all those basic amenities and signage and improving, landscaping around the entrance so that it looks like a nice place to come into. All those things really make it feel welcoming so that you can stay and, sit a while, be with your friends, whatever that may look like.
I do want to give us time to get some questions from the audience. I did want to, one of the things, and because I lived in New York for a long time, I just wanted to ask, this is something that came up, and we'll get back to some of our other questions. But Sue, when we talked about Prospect Park, and you talked about removing the 250 car parking lot, I believe.
Yeah.
And of course, New York is, I think, in a lot of ways, because people walk more, a little more friendly to not having the automobile go everywhere. But what about those motorists now? How do you balance automotive access and green space and community access? How do you explain that?
It's such a good question, Karen. And honestly, it's something that is a real struggle. And I think that the word that you used in the question, balancing that, is really the challenge and is our work. So it is now the case that cars are not allowed in Prospect Park, at all, on the Park Drive at all. As of January 2018, President Mayor de Blasio eliminated and this had been happening over a number of years. Cars had slowly been reduced in the park, to the extent that when the Park Drive was closed to traffic, it was only one side of the drive, the east side of the drive, that was still open. So it's still, there's parked vehicles, there's emergency vehicles, sometimes deliveries, obviously. So the Park Drive is closed to traffic, but there is still, between, all of the use, pedestrians, cyclists, running groups, bike races. I was just on a call this morning with the Department of Transportation about, thinking about even to the striping on the drive and how we could continue to think about enhancing the safety and well-being of all the people using the drive. Because the funny thing is that when we actually removed the cars from the park, in some ways, it made it feel slightly more, difficult or dangerous to navigate, because all of a sudden people are like, well, I can just walk anywhere. I can cross the drive. And, there's a cycling lane, there's a pedestrian lane, there's a whole lot of use going on. So it is very much about being thoughtful about the striping, about educating people on use of the drive and trying just to balance all of those usage, even to the extent of things like a cycling race. It starts at 5:30 in the morning, so that, that kind of activity and usage is hopefully in the earlier morning hours when the drive is less busy. So you're right, the balancing of cars and pedestrians is always a challenge, but closing the drive to traffic has certainly been helpful in terms of at least, not having the cars right in the park.
Okay, I just wanted to, one of the things on this panel today, we have a group of dynamic women, and we know that was not the case a couple of years ago in terms of people managing the parks. And of course, when I entered landscape architecture, there were very few women in that in that profession. But now we see that growth. But what is it that we can do in the operation and the management of parks such that we attract people of color to, and particularly youth who are using the parks, to understand and to be involved and to aspire to leadership positions? I mean, this is something that we're struggling with landscape architecture, with our Black Landscape Architecture Network, in terms of how do we make our legacy for the future, and what maybe Olmstead could not envision, but the work that we do to really make the management and the operations of park look more on senior levels like the people who we want to encourage to be there. Anybody want to tackle that one?
I can definitely jump in, Karen. We have done a couple things. We have a couple programs. One's a Woodlands Youth Crew that's been operational here in the park that we've been running for almost 20 years. And we work with two alternative high schools, one in Brooklyn, one in Manhattan. And it's a wonderful program where high school students start in April, and they work on weekends in April, and then in the summertime work full-time with us. They're paid, and they're working alongside our forest ecologists, our landscape managers, and really learning about forest restoration, trail management, ecological care of the park. And they're getting exposure both to our senior team and this expertise, but then also really learning about the work and learning about different career fields in the green sphere. And we have kids who come back who go all the way through the program, start as freshmen and continue. They move up and become supervisors in the program. And it is one way for sure that we've really worked hard to provide exposure to green jobs and green careers to young students of color in communities that otherwise maybe wouldn't have that opportunity to work in nature, especially in an urban environment. So that has been, and it's been well supported. We've got a local hospital that we didn't think we were going to be able to do it last year in the pandemic, and received support from a local hospital to help us fund the program. And it's been a great way to be able to expose young kids, teens, people of color to green jobs.
Jennifer, you have some examples out in Seattle?
We're not as far along as we'd like to be, but the youth especially, that seems to be such an important element of this, is to get kids when they're young and get promote awareness that there are these jobs. And particularly, I think that it's important to help young people understand that a park is not just a happenstance, that it's designed, that it's been shaped by the human hand
Yes.
and very intentionally and for very specific purposes. And so we're hoping to work with 8th graders, that middle school age group, to catch them before they get so busy in high school, and look at how can we get them to know their local Olmstead Park from that perspective. And so that's on our radar of things that we would like to do. But I wish so much. We have the Summer Youth Employment Program in Seattle does something similar, but I love that idea of growing through the ranks that Sue was talking about, and getting to progress and show your knowledge to the next kids that are coming up after you. That's just invaluable leadership experience and confidence building and all of those things. Yeah.
Well, I know that New York has and one of the questions that we got from our viewing audience, and I want to thank all the people who are taking time to be a part of this discussion. But the question was, are there rangers in parks like there are in national parks? And I know what happens in New York, but Layla, what do you have that kind of instructors or people who are helpers to users of the park in Louisville?
Well, you can imagine that there's a lot of calls this past year to defund the police in Louisville. So that's been a common theme that we've heard. I don't think the city is ready to do that yet. But the way I interpret it is it's not so much defunding the police as it is redirecting resources towards other agencies. And so what we would like to advocate for is a park ranger, park resource officer type program in Louisville, where you can get people to connect those who are unhoused, who may suffer from mental illness or drug addiction, connect them to the resources they need. So we are doing some research right now to determine what other cities are doing and what best practices are. But that's something that we're really pushing for at a local level right now. And it's not anything that we have currently.
I know that New York has been a leader in that. And another question that came to us is that how are Olmstead parks leveraging flow, as we call them in the profession, bicentennial, his values, history, to help achieve the 21st century mission and goals of what he stood for. And I think, and I know maybe a lot of people here are not kind of aware, but if even you listen to some of Dee, the previous program, in terms of talking about his legacy and his values of that can be transformed. But how do we continue to do that? And I know that a lot of you are, but Jennifer, you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. I have 2 small things to share about that. The first is I like to show the map that we have. We have 2 plans for Seattle, 1903 and 1908. And the 1908 map system plan we have is a much more detailed map. And it always captures the audience a little by surprise, how extensive it was and how comprehensive, that it really captures all of the genius place of Seattle, the seashore, the bluffs, the hilltop parks, the wooded ravines. And by showing people that, it really inspires people to think beyond what sometimes get pegged as the only Olmstedian parks, which are those ones that are they have the most familiar elements. And so that's one thing that I have found to be particularly effective, but also in looking at preservation and restoration in Seattle parks, we've also advocated for the expansion. Seattle has grown since the last time there was an Olmstead plan. And oftentimes the property that's acquired for parks in those expanded areas tends to be more opportunistic, that there's a parcel of land there that will make a great park, it'll serve this community. And they're lovely spaces, but it doesn't have that same vision of the genius of place. What is it about this part of town that needs to be made accessible to everyone, and not just that lot's available? What are the lots that we want to acquire, sort of looking forward, particularly because those areas right now are often wooded. They're often very naturalistic areas because they were subdivided in the 50s and 60s, so with bigger lots. But population pressure is such in Seattle that it's not going to be long before it is not as treed and that there is tighter housing. So we want to look ahead too at that application of those principles that make the rest of the Olmstead Park system so amazing.
Here's another question that asked, how do we make sure that parks appeal to all age groups and physical capacities? And we know that, of course, some of the issues were not faced when the original plans were there in terms of accessibility for all. So does anybody have any, and of course, you know we have a lot of playgrounds, but we have an aging population. I shouldn't represent that group, but anyway, how do we make sure that those their Olmstead parks can appeal to a wide variety, and as they say, the physical capacities?
Mhm.
Sue, is that something you?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in Prospect Park, we think a lot about the perimeter of the park and making sure, and so one is just accessibility and making sure that there is good access to, all areas of the park, but really thinking a lot about the perimeter of the park where there are benches, where there are areas that are easily accessible for seating. But the other thing that we're doing, we have an adult fitness area that we're creating in the park that is right next to the playground and adjacent to the playground, but is specifically designed for senior fitness and has applicable exercise equipment and ease of access and ease of entry, so that I think there's great benefit to all ages kind of being next to each other and hearing each other and enjoying each other, but to have a specific space that's designed for seniors and for exercise and for adult fitness. It's been an important priority as well.
Either of you, Layla?
I think for us, it's something we've actually struggled with quite a bit in the past year specifically. A couple of our interior park roads were closed right after COVID because of crowding and things like that to give people space to socially distance. And then came the time to figure out what to do. Do we, open them back up? And of course, it's not our decision, it's a public park. And so the Public Parks Department has the ultimate authority on what to do. And I even reached out to Sue to see what it looked like when they transitioned to a car-free experience. But it's been difficult. I mean, there's a lot of people who feel that they can't get to places that they used to love being inside the park. So one thing we're going to try to do is create just a very comprehensive map to really show people where they can go, where the flat paths are, where benches are, where parking is, so that they can really experience it, whether by, car or foot or on bicycle.
Well, we're coming close to the end, but I wanted to give an example, some time for the three of you. You may have questions for each other, or some discussion about things that you have in common. And we have a lot of wonderful Olmstead parks around the country, but I think that there are a lot of things that you've said today that can help inform people here. If anybody has one of those, I mean, there are a couple of questions coming in here, but either of you?
I wonder for both Sue and Layla with the closed drives, to continue on that, we've talked about how exactly the issue of accessibility, but also the intended experience. In Seattle, the Lake Washington Boulevard, which runs along the shoreline, is a piece of a long string of boulevards. And I see the benefit, and there's for many years been bicycle Sundays when they close the boulevard, a section of it for bicycles and pedestrians. But now there's a real movement afoot to close it permanently to vehicles in that section. I think it's about 3 miles of it. And I see all the benefits, but I also worry that it will break up that experience of being able to drive through, and not everyone can bicycle through that whole, there's some serious hills. And I certainly couldn't make the whole route. And so how do you balance that? Because it is pretty remarkable to be able to walk along that boulevard or bicycle along it without having cars zooming past. But I'm curious if you've had anybody bring up that issue of the Olmstead intention.
We have, certainly. We've heard the argument that there were roads in there for a reason. And so I think it goes back to kind of weighing both sides and the cost benefit. I mean, it is a magical experience to be in the park without cars. And the wildlife has really come out more since cars have been out. But I certainly see that people just simply can't get through it for whatever reason. Maybe they've had knee surgery, or maybe, you know, they've had some illness. So it is trying to find other spaces where they can get that same experience. So for us, if we close one section of the road in the middle of the park, can we direct them to other beautiful scenic drives that have that same experience, but maybe aren't as well known? So that's what we're trying to do.
I just wanted to say that at one point, particularly in my community development, I was trying to develop a community north of Central Park, northern Manhattan. And one of the things that I actually was in debates with parks officials about, that for community development, it was having people be able to drive in the park was a economic development issue in terms of people being able to access in that way. But of course, I've changed things evolve over time, and now, you know, I'm out trying to walk with the rest of the people. So I think it is something that you have to be sensitive and listen to all sides of the issue, and you know, to find a way to balance that. But let's see. We also had a question about well, they said Native tribes in terms of involvement in Olmstead parks, and was there any move or activities that you guys are aware of that would do indigenous people who probably were the inhabitants of some of the areas that were developed into public parks? And I guess we are doing a lot around the country in terms of this interpretation of the history of places, you know, before they were redeveloped. Any of you have, particularly Seattle, I would think, any of those issues, and how are you dealing with those? And I think you mentioned the one plaque, but it's particularly around Native American tribes.
So it's a really important part of Seattle's park history story, is that many of the places that were chosen for parks were and are still very culturally significant to the local indigenous people, the Coast Salish. So we have a number of Coast Salish tribes in the area, and they're still feeling the impact of that culturally, that they need places to gather that are in significant places. There is one in particular, Foster Island at the north end of Washington Park, is a very spiritually important place. And so how do you combine or overlap those very conflicting uses of a space? And that's an unresolved issue. But then how do you also recognize that different experiences, that parks the landscape was never pristine, it was always managed by humans. And so how do you allow those relationships with the landscape, with plants and waterways to continue? And then how do you take those Olmstedian designs and do what we talked about earlier, and be flexible enough to allow the two layers of history, the two connections to place, to coexist?
Sure.
And I think we're doing it pretty well in some places, not as well in others. I do think that awareness is a big piece of that, is just, you know, having people be aware that Native people are still here, and that it's not just a place that they like, that it's, you know, these are really embedded in the culture, the local cultures, these places. And so I don't have any great shining examples. I have lots of little pieces of this that are starting to come together.
I'm just getting a little nervous, Dee Dee, that I might be going over here, because I'd like to hear if somebody else has a response to that. But tell me if we have time to get another example of, or any information that,
One more.
okay, all right. I don't know, Layla, I mean, Louisville, there may be a little different, but what,
Well,
I mean,
we don't have the indigenous tribes here the way that they do in Seattle. So it is very different, but a lot of our parks are named after tribes. So we have Cherokee, Shawnee, Iroquois, Chickasaw, Algonquin. So you kind of get the feel of them quite a bit, but they aren't necessarily tied specifically to the tribes that were on that land. But it is a project we're looking at. There's some other Olmstead parks around the country I know who have done some work around this. So we're interested in doing it because we get asked that question a lot, actually.
did Olmstead help to name those parks, or was that, how were the names chosen?
It did not.
Okay.
It was local people who chose those names. And I think it was sort of in reaction to some of the local politicians who wanted to have the parks named after them. And they started to see how dangerous that could be and problematic. And so they wanted something that was a little more neutral, I think.
Okay, all right. Okay, Dee Dee,
All right.
take it away. All right.
Okay. Well,
Fascinating.
I really want to say thank you to all four of you for a marvelous and very provocative conversation. So thank you, Karen, Susan, Layla, and Jennifer. And how wonderful for all of us to be able to hear from you from Brooklyn, Louisville, and Seattle. And I certainly hope that all of our attendees will have been enticed into your spaces and come visit now and in 2022. And to our audience, don't miss out. Olmstead 200 activities are in full swing and will run throughout 2022. Many organizations are planning and hosting events ranging from park advocacy and public education to tours of Olmstead landscapes and conferences concerning Olmstead designs. And these will all be posted on our national calendar so that you can keep track of activities around the country. In all these ways, Olmstead 200 aims to ensure that Olmstead's legacy endures by renewing public and policy commitment to our natural and historical heritage, as we've talked about considerably over the last hour. And I think, as we've learned today as well, it's taken generations of care and stewardship to sustain these parks, and it will take a similar commitment and investment from all of us to ensure these places for future generations. So I want to encourage everyone to learn more about the bicentennial and how you can become a part of it. Please check out our website, olmstead200.org. There you can sign up for monthly newsletters and explore the national calendar, submit your local activities, and find toolkits for advocacy or education. And don't miss out on the Olmstead 200 blog, Shared Spaces, which provides interesting insights into Olmstead's life, iconic projects, and enduring impact. And I wanted to say, we were talking about Olmstead and accessibility. We just recently had in Olmstead Insider an article about Mount Royal, where Olmstead was actually envisioning access for those in wheelchairs. So I encourage people to dig into the 12 volumes of the Olmstead papers and learn more about his really visionary work in this regard. And then from the sublime to the ridiculous, shop our shop, where you can purchase your own Olmstead walking sticks, hats, and more. And please follow us on Olmstead 200 at Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So I just want to say again, thank you so much for our spectacular presenters today. And to our audience, please save the date now, September 21, when we will host our third conversation looking at Olmstead parks, equity, and public health. Have a great summer, and thanks so much.